we'll see if we can't get some of these layers here on your next case here, which deals with Section 121.
I love Section 121. When I do teach this in grad school, I always explain it's a chance to make you a hero, right? For family and friends, and it's one of those provisions that you can wield in real life to really bail somebody out of a sticky situation. So, what are we talking about here? So, we've got these taxpayers, right? And in the year 2000, they buy their house, and you get an idea in the case that things aren't really great financially from this family from the very beginning, right? Like they've got this insanely high interest rate on their mortgage here for this first house. And then at a certain point, like they can't even get a mortgage anymore, and they have to have a friend go out and borrow a mortgage for them and basically allow them to pay him back. So things are not ideal from a financial perspective here for this family. Nevertheless, in 2003, so 3 years after they buy their first house, even though clearly there's signs that they're struggling, they go out and buy a plot of land that they want to build their dream home on. So they're spreading themselves pretty thin, Damien, and this is relevant. And so they start building their dream home in 2004. Then they get to 2005. And in 2005, they sell that first house to a buyer, taking back a buyer's note. Never a great idea, right? You're assuming some risk there that the buyer is going to come through and pay. And what ends up happening here, and it becomes really the critical piece of this case, is the buyer does not end up paying on this note. They end up defaulting on this note. But what's critical is when, and we'll get into that. And so in December of 2005, and this is a big date, right? Because we're talking about a case that's hinges on dates here. December 2005, they move into the dream house that they built, okay? And things are definitely tough financially, but that doesn't prevent them from going out and spending 400 grand on a piece of land adjacent to their house. And so they just keep digging their hole deeper and deeper and deeper. Okay? So they move in December 2005. The buyer, as I said, on the previous house ends up defaulting. They don't get paid. And this isn't a small purchase price. I'm talking like a $1.5 million purchase price they end up not collecting. And so financial conditions get so bad that in September of 2007, they sell the dream house that they've been living in. Okay. So why do we care about that? They moved in December 2005. They move out, sell in September 2007, not quite 2 years, about a year and 9 months. And it's a significant gain. They sold this house for over $2 million. Now, we know that normally, you sell or any asset, a residence for a gain, you're paying tax on it because we said any accession to wealth, right? Glenshaw Glass, you have income. But as we said before, we have exceptions to that rule. And one of those exceptions, the exception that most normal, just average Joe people will avail themselves of at some point in their lives is 121. And 121 says you can exclude gain on the sale of a residence as long as you have used it as your principal residence for 2 of the previous 5 years and owned it as your principal residence for 2 of the last 5 years. So there's this ownership and use test. And it's 2 out of the previous 5 years. You meet that test, you can exclude up to 250 grand if you're single, $500,000 if you're married. I mean, it's huge, right? Obviously, especially in today's real estate market, it helps taxpayers out a lot. What I like about 121 is all the quirks. There's so many quirks, like about use getting, or ownership, I should say, getting attached to someone who didn't own it if they get the house in a divorce, and after death, how long are you deemed to have used the house or own the house if your spouse did. There's all these little quirks. One of the quirks that I just want to point out that throws people off a lot of times is when they say you have to own and use the house for 2 years out of the last 5. A lot of people misinterpret that to mean I just need 24 months of use in the last 5 years. And so let's say you split your time between New Jersey and Florida, and you're in New Jersey 7 months a year and Florida 5 months a year for 5 years. Well, you sell that Florida house and you go, wait a minute, I lived there 5 months a year for 5 years. That's 25 months in 5 years. That's more than 2 years. 2 years is 24 months. But the thing is, the definition of principal residence is such that in any given year, you can only have one principal residence. It's where did you spend the majority of your time? And in none of those 5 years was your Florida home your principal residence, because you lived in New Jersey for 7 months and Florida for 5. So it's not just a straight, if I get to 24 months, I'm good. In that situation, you never had a single year where that Florida residence was your principal residence, right? So again, not to continue to be a shameless self-promoter, but maybe 2 years ago, I wrote a long 121 article on Forbes that walks through all the kind of little quirks. The last quirk I got into in that article is what this case is about. So this couple sells their house in September 2007. They moved in December 2005. That ain't 2 years. But the statute and the regulations say if you don't make it to 2 years of ownership and use, you can use a reduced pro rata exception if you meet certain requirements. And the key to these requirements is something really bad had to happen while you were living there, right? Like you got sick, or you had to move jobs, or you got disabled, or you had extreme financial hardship, right? Or natural disaster. But the critical thing, Damien, is at the time you moved in, you couldn't reasonably foresee that that really bad thing would happen. All right. And so you could see how it would be a little tricky here, because like, how do you make that determination? Before you moved in, it couldn't be reasonable to foresee that you were going to switch jobs or you were going to get sick. I mean, the sick thing is pretty easy, right? That makes some sense. Now, these taxpayers, what they were doing here in this particular case, and it's a little unsatisfying for this reason, is they were both appealing the court for summary judgment. They just said, we want this case thrown out because, you know, we both argue that we're right, case closed, very simple. There's no material dispute as to the facts. And what the IRS was saying is, very sorry, these people cannot argue that they sold their house because of their financial hardships and that it wasn't reasonable for them to foresee this happening, because they knew darn well before they moved in 2005 that they are having financial hardships. They had a high interest mortgage. They had a friend taking out a mortgage. They had, you know, this default on the house that they had sold. So they knew they weren't going to collect those payments, but they still went out and spent 400 grand on a plot of land. But the taxpayer said, hey, not so fast. The thing is, even though you say we did, we didn't know we weren't going to collect that note until after we moved into the house. And so, as I said, the critical determination here, there's actually two of them, is number one, you couldn't reasonably foresee these circumstances arising before you moved in. And then two, those circumstances have to be the primary reason you end up selling the house. Nobody was arguing that they had sold the house for the primary reason of financial hardship. What they were arguing about is the IRS was saying you should throw out the case because they knew darn well they were in financial hardship before they moved in. And the taxpayer was saying we did not know we were in financial hardship until we found out we weren't going to collect on that buyer note. And that didn't happen until after we moved in. And long story short, Damien, again, this is where it's not quite satisfying. The court said, we need more. We need to understand more because we don't have a great timeline. We can tell there was definitely some understanding that you were struggling financially before you moved in. But what we really need to understand is when did you know for sure you weren't going to collect on that buyer note? And so we know there was some financial hardship, but you know, there is still a possibility that you didn't truly know how bad things were until after you had moved in. And so we don't have a winner declared in this court. They just refused to, you know, award summary judgment to either side. So now they're going to have to go back and say, how do we know at what point in time you truly knew you were up against it financially, right? Like you knew that you weren't going to collect on that note. Now, I will say to you, one of the reasons I chose this case is it gives me a chance to talk about, to me, what is one of the most fascinating PLRs in the last 10 years. And it shows how flexible the IRS can be sometimes with these unforeseen circumstances. You had this PLR 2016-28002, and what it did is think about everything we just talked about, right? You move into a place, you can't reasonably foresee circumstances that end up arising and cause you to sell it. In this PLR, Damien, you got husband and wife with one baby. They move into a 2-bedroom condo. A year goes by, they find out they're pregnant, and they sell the condo after only 1 year of the 2. And so must have sold the condo for a big gain because they wanted to avail themselves of the reduced exclusion. And the reduced exclusion would be simple. If you owned and used it for 1 year instead of 2, you would take 1/2 of your eligible exclusion, right? So they appealed to the IRS in a PLR and said, when we moved in and had our one child, we could not reasonably foresee that we would have a second child. And the IRS agreed, which I find just kind of insane because listen, like, you know, we're all adults here. You engage in certain behaviors. There is a possibility you're going to have a second child. And a young couple with one child, how can you argue it was you couldn't reasonably foresee that you would have a second child, need another bedroom, and have to sell your 2-bedroom condo to get a 3-bedroom home or whatever it may be? But the IRS sided with them in that PLR, and they said, hey, you know, we don't think you could have reasonably. Now, in the regulations, they explain that if, like you have twins, right?
I do. Yep.
Yeah. They explain in the regulations, if you have twins when you own a house and suddenly you're like, oh boy, I need some more space, that's a good reason to sell a house under the unforeseen circumstances rule. But having one child and then having a second child a year later, I don't get how you can't reasonably foresee that. Again, I like this case because you have this critical determination. It's not just about why did we sell the house. It's could we have known that that circumstance was going to arise before we moved in? And that's, again, what I really enjoy about this case is like, it's so specific that the IRS said we should win because they knew they had financial hardship, and the taxpayer said we should win because we didn't know how bad things were until after the date we moved in. And now they're going to have to go back and trial and prove, when did you know?
Yeah, which is a hard thing to do going back in that time frame. So, and I'm just sitting here thinking as you're talking about, you know, what if I had this come to me, right, and this fact pattern. So I'll ask you this: I mean, what do you do going into, like, if you're talking to this family here with their hardship and wanting to claim it, how do you approach it?
Boy, I'll tell you, based on the facts that I saw in the case, I would have a hard time believing or being comfortable taking the position that unforeseen circumstances had arisen that forced them to sell that house, right? Because again, I mean, their financial struggles are well documented from 2000 to 2005 before they moved in. But their counter argument is that, hey, we could have survived those struggles. It was not collecting on the buyer note that really killed us. So I get it. I understand why they'd want to pursue it. It's just my understanding of the common definition of an unforeseen circumstance is that you really, you know, it's got to come out of the blue, like a natural disaster or getting sick or a change of jobs. But if you're struggling financially where you can't even get a mortgage, man, it's hard for me to argue that you didn't see this coming.